You know, sometimes the story of a single piece of military hardware can tell you everything you need to know about a nation's fatal blind spot. This story starts not with a blueprint, but in the total chaos of battle, with a discovery so shocking it would change everything.
Okay, so I want you to picture this. It's Saipan, 3:30 in the morning, June 17th, 1944. It is pitch black, and out of that darkness comes the sound of clanking treads and roaring diesel engines. It's the largest Japanese tank attack of the entire Pacific War, and it's rumbling right towards the American lines. And right in the middle of all that chaos, something impossible is about to happen.
Imagine you're that Marine, dug into a foxhole. You see these huge, dark shapes of enemy tanks coming right at you. You open up with your heavy machine gun, fully expecting the bullets to just ping off the armor, but they don't. Instead, you see a flash of sparks inside the enemy tank. All along the line, Marines are watching in total disbelief as their standard-issue machine guns are literally shredding the Japanese armor, turning these tanks into burning steel coffins.
So this is the big question, right? How is that even possible? How could a regular machine gun, a Browning M2, destroy a nation's main battle tank? Well, the answer isn't just about steel. It's about a fatal miscalculation, a huge mistake made a decade earlier. We really need to understand why this armor was so thin in the first place.
And here it is. This is the core of the problem. The Japanese Type 95 Hago tank, the absolute backbone of their armored forces, was protected by just 12 millimeters of steel. That's at its strongest point. To put that in perspective, we're talking less than half an inch. It was basically designed to stop rifle bullets. And that's about it.
Now look at this. The simple, brutal math on this slide tells the whole story. An American .50 caliber armor-piercing round could punch right through 23 millimeters of steel from 200 meters out. That's nearly double the Hago's thickest armor. The Japanese tankers inside never stood a chance. Their protection, it was a deadly illusion. To really understand this catastrophic vulnerability, we have to rewind the clock back to the 1930s and look at the war Japan thought it was going to fight. See, they weren't stupid. They were just preparing for a completely different enemy on a completely different battlefield.
So here's the thing. The Hago wasn't a bad tank. In fact, for its intended role, it was a perfect tank. It was fast, it was light enough for the awful roads and rickety bridges in China, and it was more than powerful enough to support infantry against an enemy who had basically zero anti-tank weapons. It was a product of confidence, designed for a very specific job that it did incredibly well.
And this is why the Japanese crews were so confident, almost arrogant about their machines. In China, their tanks were just unstoppable. In Malaya, they drove through jungle terrain that British thought was totally impassable for armor, leading this lightning-fast conquest. They even did pretty well against early American M3 Stuart tanks in the Philippines. Every single victory just hammered home this belief that their design was right and their tank was invincible. But at Saipan, that whole decade of confidence just slams head-on into a brand new reality. It's an industrial superpower with a completely different philosophy of war. This wasn't just a battle of tanks. It was a battle of two completely different worlds colliding.
I mean, just look at this comparison. It's not a fair fight. It's a complete mismatch in every single category. The Sherman weighs over 4 times as much. It has over 4 times the armor. And that armor is angled, which makes it even tougher. And it has a main gun that could knock out a Hago from over a mile away. But the real story, the part that's even more lopsided, is when you look at the crew in the radio.
This right here might be the Hago's most critical, most crippling design flaw. The commander had to do everything. He had to spot targets, tell the driver where to go, load the main gun, aim the main gun, and then fire it. And he had to do all of this while standing up, crammed into a tiny, hand-cranked turret. Meanwhile, the Sherman has a 3-man team in its turret, working together like a well-oiled machine. It's not just a disadvantage, it was an impossible workload that just crippled the tank's effectiveness in a real fight. The result of this collision of worlds was, well, a predictable and total catastrophe for the Japanese forces. What was supposed to be this decisive blow that would throw the Americans back into the sea, it just turned into a slaughter. 31. That's how many of their tanks, the very core of their armored force on the island, were left burning on the field. But this tactical defeat wasn't just about one bad morning. It pointed to a much, much larger strategic problem that Japan had absolutely no way of solving. Because you see, the real battle wasn't fought on the beaches of Saipan. It was won years earlier in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. That thin armor on the Hago, it was just a symptom of a much deeper industrial weakness. The sheer scale of this industrial difference is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Over the entire war, Japan built about 2,300 Hago tanks. In that same time, the United States built nearly 50,000 Shermans. Think about that. For every one Hago Japan produced, America was building more than 20 Shermans. It was a numbers game Japan could never, ever win.
And let's just break that down even more, because this is where it gets truly staggering. One single American factory, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, could produce more Sherman tanks in 1 month than the entire nation of Japan could build in a whole year. How can you possibly compete with that? You just can't.
And it wasn't just about pumping out huge numbers. Every single American tank was a generation ahead. They had stabilized guns so they could fire while moving, radios in every tank so they could coordinate attacks, better optics, better reliability. Every part of the design was about giving the crew inside the best possible chance to win and to survive.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Why are we even talking about it today? Well, the story of the Type 95 Hago is way more than a history lesson about one tank. It's a timeless, powerful warning.
This quote from a captured Japanese tank officer, man, it just says it all. The survivors had to face this devastating truth, that all the courage, all the devotion, all the fighting spirit they were told was their greatest weapon, it meant nothing against overwhelming industrial and technological power. All that bravery was just tragically wasted.
When you boil it all down, Japan perfected a weapon for the wars of the 1930s against enemies with no real way to fight back. They built their entire strategy and their confidence on those early wins, and then they completely failed to adapt when the world changed. They brought a knife to a gunfight, and the result was inevitable.
And that really leaves us with one final, kind of uncomfortable thought. A question for all of us, really. The Japanese were convinced their light, fast tanks were a strength, right up until a .50 caliber bullet proved they were a fatal weakness. So what are our blind spots? What unexamined beliefs in our technology, in our businesses, in our own lives are our thin armor today, just waiting to be exposed when the next great test comes along?